despite having the best conditions in Europe for growing trees, we have a totally dysfunctional forestry model in this country. And that hasn't changed in the 11 years I'm in the Dáil now. I don't claim to be an expert in forestry, but my interest was piqued beyond a general interest, I suppose, in forestry as just beautiful places before that, but in the whole issue back in 2013, when the government of the day had agreed with the Troika to sell the harvesting rights of the entire forest estate in this country, Coilse's forestry estate. And at that time I brought what was the first private member's motion on forestry to that Dáil, possibly the only one that was brought in that Dáil, as part of the campaign to stop the at that time agreed sell-off of Coilse's harvesting rights to most likely an entity called the International Forestry Fund, which at the time was fronted by the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, operating from a little office in Dunleary on the Blana Avenue, where the main financiers behind it were a crowd called Helvetica Wealth, a Swiss wealth asset management operation. So that was the plan back then, was to go from the already fairly dysfunctional Coilse model of Sitka spruce, completely commercially driven, from consistent failure to achieve afforestation targets to actually just wholesale privatisation of forests. Now, the big protests that we held at the time were successful. We mobilised huge protests down in Rathdrum, in Avondale, and protests around the country, and as a result of those protests, the government abandoned the agreed plan in the Memorandum of Understanding with the Troika to sell off the harvesting rights. And that was an important victory. But sadly, when it should have prompted a fundamental rethinking of the Irish forestry model and to move it away from that sort of corporatised focus with essentially industrial forest model based on Sitka spruce and monocultures, and essentially a failure to take advantage of the climactic conditions in this country to develop Irish forestry, things have remained much the same for the interceding 11 years. And despite often, reasonable rhetoric, promises of change, promises to hit increased afforestation targets, promises to move away from the industrial monocultural model, we then hear recently that there is a plan to team up with Gresham House, an investment fund, with Coilse to advance afforestation in Ireland, along with Coilse, and a joint venture with Coilse. And that really sort of, to me, says it all. That what Coilse is doing has been operating a sort of for-profit, largely, with some sort of decorative nods to getting back to developing native woodlands, to diversifying Ireland's forest estate, developing a sustainable forest model, and acting generally as the guardians of the forest estate. Instead, what it's doing is teaming up with an international investment fund in order to compete with farmers, rather than actually support them, which is what its role should be, to support them. Instead, it's going to compete with them and potentially run them out of business, making it even more difficult for farmers to engage in forestry, when precisely we should be doing the opposite. And to the extent that we are thoroughly discrediting the whole project of afforestation in the minds of many in rural Ireland who might be interested in forestry if they were supported and if Coillte saw their role not as to operate as a sort of competing, dominant business corporate force, competing with the small farmer, but actually saw as its role to support them and also to be the one that operates as the guardian of the forest estate. And it really seems nothing has changed in that regard. I mean, we hear of some moves to kind of transition the monocultural sort of plantations of Coillte to more diverse native woodlands, but really how much of that is actually happening? And when you think about the campaign we had to have recently with Killagar Wood, where up in Enniskerry, where Coillte had planned quietly to sell off a forest to whoever, right, you really wonder what is going on in Coillte and what its agenda, is. And indeed, when you look at the personnel involved in the forest policy group that formed Project Woodland, 57.7% of them commercial, of the people in that policy group. You just again get a sense of the government not understanding that we need to dramatically change our forestry model, and in particular, Coillte has a particular role to be the guardian of the forest estate, but simultaneously to support the small farmers. If we want farmers to move into forestry, then we have to and to assist us in our climate action, in enhancing biodiversity, we have to genuinely support them, engage with them, listen to them, and simultaneously Coilte's mandate, its fundamental mandate, has to change from the one that it's currently operating. I suspect we are still a long way, sadly, from that.